Hi, this is a video about making my controls even worse by playing TF2 twice at the same time, but why would I ever want to do this? Well, have you ever played Medic at Casual and have your heal targets constantly waste your Uber? Or maybe you've wanted a pocket medic of your own, or just want a new, super competitive way to play. Now, this is a YouTube video and we need to replicate the average YouTuber's ego. Clearly, the only one worthy of my Ubers is me, so how do we solve this problem? Well, shortly after mapping most class controls to a little over 2 buttons in my last video, I realized that given the right controllers, I could play TF2 one-handed. If I could play TF2 once with one hand and getting TF2 a second time is free, then I could theoretically play TF2 twice with both hands. So, which controller should we use? We need 2 mirrored controllers, one for each hand, each having enough buttons to play TF2 with. This beats 2 or 3 easily accessible buttons to cover most class actions, a joystick or D-pad for movement, a crouch jump button, and mouse or gyro controls for aiming. If using 2 mice, the hardest part would likely be movement. While most weapon actions fit on the mouse buttons, most mice lack a joystick or D-pad, and the closest thing is probably the fancy bidirectional scroll wheels that some mice have. If you have 2 mice like that, this could work for you. Since 2 keyboards are out of the question due to lack of aiming, we need to find a controller that meets our criteria, which is likely either some obscure VR controller I don't have, Nintendo Switch Joy-Cons, or 2 Wii remotes. Good job to Nintendo for making such unique controllers, I guess. Now, connecting these controllers to a computer is easy, since they both use Bluetooth, so they can just be connected using that. Getting the inputs from the controllers to be received in-game is a bit harder, however. After finding out Steam's input system, or at least TF2, doesn't support either of these controllers, I used an external program to convert the controller inputs to simulated keyboard and mouse inputs, which are then used in-game. The program I used was JoyShock Mapper for anyone interested. It seems to be the best of the bunch. It works on Windows and supposedly Linux, more on that later. To get the Wii Remote input to work, I installed these drivers, which... wait, don't use this software to harm or kill anybody. Well, there goes my next video idea. Oh well, anyway, our next step is to get TF2 running twice simultaneously. Games like TF2 that use a source engine can't normally do this, so we need to get creative. My first attempt was using a virtual machine, which effectively emulates a computer inside a computer. The emulated computer runs as if it were a hardware computer, though not everything could be perfectly emulated in the other computer, so some games may not run. And the virtual machine is merely a program in my real computer, leaving me effectively with 2 computers. Now we just run TF2 on both computers, and it seems it isn't running on a virtual machine. So, after finding some random old computer I had lying around, I have 2 actual computers and can now run TF2 twice. Of course, when I said I'd get to the Linux build of JoyShock Mapper later, I mean it's not compiling, and that's a bit of a problem. Since switching Linux builds has the same risk of JoyShock Mapper not working, I just went with Windows for the second computer. After getting all that working, we should now be able to test our various input methods. So, shortly into testing controllers, I found the Wiimotes aren't going to work. Unfortunately, there's just too few buttons within single-handed pressing range of the D-pad, and no awkward way of holding it was going to fix that. The Joy-Cons fare much better, being much smaller and more condensed, though they aren't exactly mirrored like the Wiimotes are. Luckily, I have 2 sets, so depending on how I hold them, I can make some buttons line up with the same fingers on each hand. Then comes the final problem. My Joy-Cons drift. Okay, screw Nintendo for even allowing that to happen. Luckily, we don't necessarily need a joystick to move. We could also use a pseudo D-pad for it. So, here's the mapping I use. Use these buttons to move and slam your thumb on all of them to crouch jump. Pressing the joystick down locks gyro, the plus button uses Uber, and the triggers act as the mouse buttons. Those use the same binds from my last video, which map most weapon actions to the 2 mouse buttons, of course. For my left hand, I use the exact same controls, with the only caveat that this Joy-Con digs into my skin a little. Also, the Bluetooth receiver I plugged into the other computer is really weak, so I'll have to stand really close to it for it to work. But now that everything is truly working, and after testing a little with bots, it seems it's actually somewhat playable. The controls barely let me rocket jump, my divided attention barely puts my attentiveness just over the average heavy and casual, and I walk into walls every 10 seconds, but it's playable. So, I joined the server with an environment just as competitive as these binds. Community Instant Respawn 2 for it. It's time for some gameplay, and probably to get sniped and backstabbed several times.
Big surprise, I know. and the other team literally has a fucking bot.
That's not a medic bot. That's actually also me. I'm controlling each character with a single Joy-Con. It is
How
hard.
the fuck?
No one has ever done that! No one has ever done that in the history of
Team Fortress 2.
Everything worked perfectly, but how well does this fare on a map with an actual objective? My alt account kept having trouble queuing for casual, so I ended up finding another community server running Payload. Also, considering this might count as cheating to some people, even though this definitely puts me at a disadvantage, I made sure to ask people on the server what they thought of me doing this, though this also had an effect of bringing a few
Yeah,
people's
it's funny,
attention
but
to
that
it.
sounds so awful. Holy shit, dude. He's pocketing
Oh
himself.
my god, he is, you can tell. Wait, when one moves, the other one doesn't move.
How does that even work?
But yeah, one guy
I
playing
better go play MDM with my 6 Joy-Cons.
Then the other 4, like, you can have whatever you want, but you have to control them with your hands and feet.
He's playing 2 people and he's still healing the teammates. Oh my gosh.
Now, when I got on Red on a server without instant respawns, I was initially wondering if this would be a problem when one account dies, though this ended up having an interesting effect of its own. If I played recklessly enough, I could just bypass the respawn time, having one player respawn just as the other dies. Nice. Anyway, here's more gameplay, this time on CP Dust Bowl.
It's been a while, you forgot who it is.
No way the medic solo captain wins the whole
All that you remember is that you don't like
No way the
him.
medic solo caps, guys! No way the medic solo caps, guys!
No way the medic solo cap!
Death.
Yeah, one meg did it. We did absolutely nothing.
Yeah, guys.
We just fucking
So, in conclusion, I'm happy to announce I'll no longer have to use the arrow keys to game, because I've got a much better setup. Using 2 right Joy-Cons without the joystick because it drifts, of course, and mashing the D-pad to jump so I don't have to use another button, buttons are a little enemy, of course, standing really close to my Bluetooth receiver because it's really weak at running 2 instances of the same game at the same time while one of my computers is a potato.